felony conviction is a socially constructed lived experience that extends the past into the future and, in doing so, renders men and women with felony records socially disabled.
In this statement from Keisha Middlemass in her book Convicted and Condemned, she highlights how past offenses exact a heavy toll even after release from prison.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to Punishment in the High Country, a podcast series produced by NAU CCJ students focusing on the U.S. carceral state as it comes to life in northern Arizona. Each episode examines issues related to power, mass criminalization, incarceration, and social injustice. This episode is about life after incarceration and the trials and tribulations of reoffending in Coconino County. I am one of your hosts, Noah Schotten.
I'm your other host, Jack Spano.
Today we'll be delving into the topic of life after incarceration, the issues that formerly incarcerated people face that may cause them to reoffend, and the potential solutions to these problems in the lens of Arizona and Coconino County.
Yes, we will also be answering the questions such as why do people reoffend, and how can the recidivism rate of Coconino County citizens living with a record be positively affected. For this episode, we have had the privilege of interviewing two individuals on either side of the issues in incarceration, probation, recidivism, and rehabilitation. Our interviewees will be introducing themselves in a few minutes. We'll be starting with Jeff Baran, who is a U.S. probation officer with experience in supervised release, working with defendants on indigenous reservations as well as the city of Phoenix.
And the other is my good friend Ben Bethel, a political reform activist and former felon who has dealt with life after incarceration and has fought for the reinstatement of progressive rehabilitation both nationally and locally. Both of these interviews will provide opposing yet important perspectives on the issue of recidivism and the problems of probation and where it needs to be improved. To give some context to our listeners, we'll first dive into the rates of recidivism in the United States, along with some major problems that formerly incarcerated people face when taking the steps to reintegrate back into society, and why these issues can easily contribute to recidivism.
Yeah, so recidivism rates in America are very high, with a 2021 study conducted by the Bureau of Justice Statistics showing that over a 5-year period, 71% of formerly incarcerated people were rearrested. What these numbers are telling us is that prison simply isn't working, especially the programs that follow one's release from prison, most often coming in the form of probation or parole.
And probation is designed with the purpose of providing assistance to formerly incarcerated people, which in theory is an amazing service, but in reality this comes with intense surveillance. Often probationers are subject to tracking devices, drug and alcohol tests, and constant check-ins from probation officers. All of these tools are implemented with the idea that the person on probation will be less likely to reoffend and end up back in prison, but what these things really do is make their life more challenging, making recidivism much more likely to occur.
Yeah, for sure. Looking at some info on probation here in our home state, according to the Bureau of Justice Assistance, the prison population growth in Arizona is heavily associated with probation violations, with the majority of those on probation being property or drug offenders. Almost half of these violations involve substance abuse. Some laws have been changed to reduce violations in high-risk offenders, but rates are still very high overall.
We also see that some reasons for these high rates of recidivism simply come from the challenges and the stigma that every formerly incarcerated person must deal with. When someone is labeled a felon, they live in this sort of gray area of society where most people only view them in that light, including and crucially potential employers.
And without work and stable pay, options are limited for simply surviving in the world, often turning people back to crime. Additionally, formerly incarcerated people often have trouble finding stable housing, with many homeowners and landlords automatically discrediting anyone with a felony on their record wanting to rent or purchase a home after a quick background check.
There are also the options of halfway houses and transitional housing, which many formerly incarcerated people rely on both initially after being released and long term. But far too often, these places that are meant to help a person back on their feet instead fail to offer adequate reentry support, follow-up, and may lack treatment that is effective in reducing risk factors for reoffending.
So yeah, we have touched on many of the issues that people face after being incarcerated. So why don't we let our listeners hear firsthand about the problems that arise, as well as some potential solutions to our concerns on recidivism. I think it is about time that we let our guests shine some better light for us. And as we mentioned before, you'll be hearing from two different perspectives when it comes to recidivism and probation through our interviewees, where there might actually be some agreement from opposite sides of the system. I asked Jeff Baran, a U.S. probation officer, where he thinks the probation system in America can improve.
I'm sure you've heard the Scandinavian model. That's essentially the gold standard across the world, quite frankly. You know, the more we can get to that program such as that, I think if you put the Scandinavian model in the U.S., the fact that they're definitely more oriented towards rehabilitation is definitely a good place to start.
So hearing his perspective from a probation officer, seemingly wanting to implement the practices that we have learned about in college, seeking to help formerly incarcerated people, rather than make their lives more difficult seems like a step in the right direction. He also talked about the prison system itself and the severe lack of rehabilitation programs even before someone is released from prison.
Most people come out more criminally minded when they go in, and that's especially true for younger individuals.
Hearing about the view from a probation officer about the downfalls of the prison system is important, and I think it even shows that the idea of rehabilitation is hopefully beginning to have some weight in how the criminal justice system handles these cases.
Yeah, Jeff really had some great things to say. As for our other guest, Ben Bethel, he has dealt with rehabilitation from a life of crime firsthand. He was arrested on drug possession charges and was facing up to 21 years in prison due to mandatory minimum sentencing laws. Luckily, he took action to try and fix what he could in his life before his trial. Here's how he turned his life around.
As soon as I was arrested, I had the realization that it was important to do what the courts were probably going to tell me to do at sentencing and do that before they told me to do it. So I did get myself into rehabilitation program, into therapy, into counseling, more volunteering, as much full-time work as I could take. I had probably 2 or 3 jobs at the time. So I think that all of that was looked at very favorably to the justice system and the judge and both the prosecutor and the public defender.
Ben has a progressive ideology of crime and probation and believes that anyone can change with the right mindset and tools for success. He's a perfect example. As for what we can do to help, he said this.
I think that another thing that's important is make sure that people's basic human needs are met, right? Like the need for your basic healthcare and your education and a roof over your head and food on the table are going to have you be a happy and hopefully healthy and productive member of society that's not a public charge on society as a whole through downstream increased expenses. Because when people don't have their needs met and they're hopeless, they often turn to crime.
Both of our guests had insightful things to say about how we can help the recidivism rate in Coconino County and nationally. It was surprising to see that even on opposite poles of the criminal justice system, the sentiment is very similar as to what we can do to help end the cycle. After hearing from our guests and conducting extensive research on the topic, we concluded there are numerous ways that could mend the current system and how it is set up to put people back into incarceration rather than back into society.
Agreed. First, in general nationally, we need to see a larger stand against how the system is set up. The primary and most effective way of doing so is to lobby for policy reforms.
Some issues that we can seek to change include poor probation and supervision policies and low funding for transitional housing and programs which could highly contribute to recidivism nationwide. A big issue in the county is homelessness and addiction, which can be helped through allocating resources to better shelters and rehabilitation centers.
Some other ways to seek change on a smaller scale can be made possible through enhancing local re-entry programs for those in need. And as we said before, halfway houses and transitional housing are crucial to the success of re-entry for those who need help getting back on their feet after being incarcerated. So it is very important that they receive adequate funding and support to run effectively.
Another method to shift the system in Coconino County is to get rid of the stigma surrounding formerly incarcerated individuals. This can be done by raising awareness of the current conditions and reality of the system and how it is set up against those being released.
People are less likely to cooperate with others and offer the help that they need with the negative stigma surrounding incarceration. Felons can be considered socially disabled, mainly due to the stigma which limits their opportunities post-release.
Absolutely. Addressing the negative stigma at a local level is a definite way of creating more opportunities for re-entry success in the community. Job programs for people with a record could also be extremely beneficial.
We urge anyone at all interested or affected by these issues to get involved in community-based support organizations that can assist people with re-entry or anything that helps fight for better rehabilitation processes of formerly incarcerated individuals. Without regular people like you and me, many of these systemic issues will never change.
We'd like to offer a huge thanks to you, the audience, for listening to our episode of the Punishment in the High Country podcast. At the heart of all of this is the simple truth that we're all human trying to find our way in the world. The goal in reducing recidivism and aiding life post-incarceration is to reawaken humanity in those who have been deeply impacted by the criminal justice system, instead of perpetuating the cycle of mass incarceration that is so prominent in the United States. These are people who may have lost pieces of themselves along the way and are trying to turn their life around through rehabilitation and rediscovery. Our goal first and foremost should be to help these people the best we can, not to scrutinize them over a small mistake that could cost them more years of their life behind bars. To wrap it up into one single sentence, civil rights activist Michelle Alexander said it best: "Justice is not about punishment, it's about restoration."